with a title like this for my paper and facial hair, some of you might wonder if I made a wrong turn and was supposed to be at an alternate symposium going on this weekend. But I assure you, this is the title. It was reportedly, Hugh Nibley said a number of years ago, we need more anti-Mormon books. They keep us on our toes. Now, those of you that were at the Fair Conference last year might remember Ross Barron. He gave a dynamic talk, and he talked about the word columbusity, which was a fairly recently coined word by Neil Postman. And he said that while serendipity means finding something of value by accident, columbusity is the opposite. It means having found something of value and not knowing it. Ross Barron said, we've hit some columbusity with regards to anti-Mormons. They're a great thing for us. Do you realize the scholarship of the church, the convert baptism, the strengthening of the members as a result of anti-Mormons? They've been one of the greatest blessings. Now, in my paper today, I'll try to demonstrate that despite an impediment to gospel growth, and we most certainly do experience apostasy because of anti-Mormons, that critics nevertheless fill a necessary role as part of the gospel plan and oftentimes positively influence Latter-day Saint scholarship. The question might be, can opposition be beneficial? More than 2.5 millennium ago, the prophet Lehi said, for it must needs be... Oh, back up one. Maybe I skipped one here. Okay. Let's go ahead and read, and I'll read what Lehi's statement is, or maybe I got one out of order. For it must needs be that there is an opposition to all things. If not so, righteousness could not be brought to pass. Neither wickedness, neither holiness, nor misery, neither good nor bad. Now, while we hold no love for the devil, Satan and evil are necessary for man's free agency and hence progression. We read that in DMC 2939. As Lehi explains, without opposition, there would be no need for mankind's creation. Lack of opposition, he notes, must needs destroy the wisdom of God and his eternal purposes, and also the power and mercy and the justice of God. In a strange but very real way, Satan is part of the gospel plan. If it were not for Satan, Adam and Eve would not have progressed with their fall in the garden. If not for Satan, we would not have the opportunity to choose righteousness and happiness over wickedness and misery. Although we are at a constant battle with Satan, and we should avoid his temptations like the plague, he is a necessary evil to help us move forward. Which brings us to the purpose of my paper, our relationship with anti-Mormons and other LDS critics. And I don't mean to imply that all critics are satanic or evil, although some of them I think fit that bill. But rather, that opposition appears to be necessary for intellectual as well as spiritual growth. If not for the critics, some of the fascinating LDS scholarly studies may not have been noticed. Mormon critics have actually strengthened LDS scholarship. Brigham Young said, every time you kick Mormonism, you kick it upstairs. You never kick it downstairs. The Lord Almighty so orders it. Now, just as it would be irresponsible to recommend yielding to Satan so that growth can be gained in overcoming temptation, it would likewise be irresponsible to encourage anti-Mormonism to promote LDS scholarship. Ezra Taft Benson once said, we are far removed from the days of our forefathers, who were persecuted for their peculiar beliefs. Some of us seem to want to share the reward, but are oftentimes afraid to stand up for the principles that are controversial in our generation. We need not solicit persecution, but neither should we remain silent in the presence of overwhelming evils, for this makes cowards of men. Now, Satan's opposition can bring spiritual death. It can also, however, bring spiritual strength. Likewise, detractors have brought spiritual blindness to Latter-day Saints and investigators, but critics have also enhanced our understanding of Mormon issues and scriptures. Occasionally, even the critics are right and point out details from a different perspective, which in turn have launched new LDS studies. And often, when tackling difficult issues, positions are clarified, new insights are gleaned, new perspectives are identified, and new appreciations are gained. As John Sorensen explained, the critics often, quote, push LDS scholars to phrase in fuller, clearer, and better documented ways what we have already known and said, briefly and incompletely. Likewise, Brigham Young once said, let us alone, and we will send elders to the uttermost parts of the earth, and gather out Israel, wherever they are. And if you persecute us, we will do it the quicker, because we are naturally dull when let alone, and are disposed to take a little sleep, a little slumber, and a little rest. If you let us alone, we will do it a little more leisurely. But if you persecute us, we will sit up nights to preach the gospel. At another time, he said, every time they persecute and try to overcome his people, they elevate us and weaken their own hands and strengthen the hands and the arms of his people. And every time they undertake to lessen our numbers, they increase it. Righteousness and power with God increase in his people in proportion as the devil struggles to destroy it. I've gathered a list of just a few of the areas in which the critics have helped LDS scholarship. Now, in the interest of time, I'll try to focus on a couple of them, and if we have a little time, I'll try to get on some of the less noticeable ones. Okay, first is Book of Mormon studies. Now, it's important to understand that for the major part of the church history, the Book of Mormon was not really received as for the attention of the object of study. Until recently, the main focus of the Book of Mormon has been as aspect as a vehicle through which personal revelation could be gained, rather than a text which should be studied for spiritual and intellectual insights. With the exception of a few notable LDS intellects, the church as a whole did not devote a lot of attention to a real study of the Book of Mormon until recently. BYU, for example, didn't require students to study the Book of Mormon until 1961. And the church Sunday school curriculum didn't include the Book of Mormon as a course of study until 1972. Some of the critics there, therefore, occasionally noticed things before the saints did. Oh, I got a few of these out of order. Go ahead and back up again. Let's try that one more time. Now, let's back up. We'll come back to that one here. Okay, first one is anachronisms. And anachronisms and absurdities. And when I think of the word anachronisms, I have to think of what John Twetness mentioned yesterday about waiving the rents. That's always going to stick in my mind now. Among the earliest and most notable early anti-Mormons, we find Methodist minister Leroy Sunderland, who in 1838 wrote a book attempting to discredit Mormonism. He noted what he believed to be grammatical errors, plagiarisms, absurdities, and such as records being engraved on brass plates. And in 1857, former Mormon John Hyde wrote an anti-Mormon book wherein he expressed amusement with a number of Book of Mormon items. His critique is laced with descriptive words such as contradict, pretends, imposture, inconsistency, ridiculous, and ignorant. Among the many items which Hyde saw as sure, quote, proof of imposture, end quote, will be included the horse, elephant, sheep, swine, Nephi's compass, and other absurdities like Nephi shipbuilding, a temple building, Jaredite barges, the brother of Jared's shining stones, and Lehi's odd habit of renaming rivers and valleys. Hyde criticized the Book of Mormon for copying King James Bible, quote, verbatim, as well as the use of the words church, cemetery, and glass. In his chapter dedicated to analyzing the Book of Mormon, he concludes, the Book of Mormon consists of two parts. One is stolen and the other original. Its copy parts consist of plagiarisms culled from the commonest books, collected without knowledge and combined without skill. Its original part is a mass of contradictions and miracles sublimed into absurdities. To attempt to palm the whole on human credulity as a revelation from God is folly and fraud. Now, many LDS critics have not really moved beyond Hyde's arguments, whereas LDS scholarship has grown by leaps and bounds. Scholars have dealt with virtually all of these accusations of Hyde's and have demonstrated that the Book of Mormon is supposedly anachronistic and absurd items are neither anachronistic nor absurd. In many cases, the arguments have backfired and turned from impugning the Book of Mormon to supporting the Book of Mormon. Last year's Fair Conference, again, you might remember Matt Roper's paper, Boomerang Hits in the Book of Mormon. And he discussed many of the ways in which the Book of Mormon has been vindicated against the critics and actually strengthened because of the Nephite scripture as it described very real things which were contrary to what most informed people of Joseph Smith's day believed. A more recent charge of anachronistic language in the Book of Mormon is the use of the term tenths, when tenths were supposedly not known in Book of Mormon lands and times. This accusation prompted John Sorensen to do a little in-depth homework, which he detailed in an issue of Farms Review of Books. I quote, "In the course of my response, I looked up and spelled out a certain amount of new information. New in the sense that it's not having been utilized in any previous discussions of the Book of Mormon about the occurrence of tenths in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. So my rebuttal to the critic in the article made a substantive, though minor, contribution to Book of Mormon scholarship on the point of tenths. Now, in 1887, Reverend M.T. Lamb, a Baptist minister, wrote an anti-Mormon book decrying not only what he saw as anachronisms, such as wheat and barley, iron and steel, and records on gold plates. But what he also saw as incongruities in the saints' perception of Book of Mormon lands and the realities of population growth and travel distances. In 1909, B.H. Roberts took notice of the critics and took measures to find answers. He wrote a 3-volume work entitled A New Witness for God, which dealt directly with some of the anti-Mormon charges of the day. Okay, geography. For the most of church's history, the Latter-day Saints have generally believed in what's been called the hemispheric model of the Book of Mormon, which would have included North America, South America, Panama Canal being the narrow neck of the land. Such a view suggested the Nephites were exterminated in upstate New York. A number of Latter-day Saints pointed to many Indian artifacts in New York as evidence for the Nephite extermination. Critics like Lamb and later others questioned travel distances and population sizes necessary for a hemispheric model. The critics also charged the Book of Mormon could not be true, based on the popular LDS belief that all American Indians were descendants of Lamanites, and we'll get to more of this later. In New Witness, Roberts referred to Lamb's criticism of the Book of Mormon's supposed rapid population growth, as well as problems regarding long-distance travel within a hemispheric model of the Book of Mormon. While Roberts continued to favor a hemispheric model, he acknowledged some validity to this criticism and recognized the possibility for a limited geography for the Book of Mormon. While there's some debate of whether or not Lamb influenced Roberts, who in turn influenced other Latter-day Saint scholars, it's certain that the current scholarly view on the Book of Mormon geography is not the same as what the traditional view was. It seems likely that questions raised by detractors and pursued by Roberts sparked an interest among other LDS scholars until a more consistent model of Book of Mormon geography could be developed upon closer reading of the text. In environmental influence is another area. In 1921, a young member by the name of W.E. Reiter wrote to Apostle James Talmage concerning some of the religious discussions he had with a non-Mormon chemist, James Couch, who after studying the Book of Mormon had drawn up a list of 5 not necessarily original criticisms. Number 1, let's go to the next one. Now let's back up. I edited this morning. I must have, go ahead and back up again. One more. I edited this morning, and I must have somehow got these out of sync. Let's talk about the list that he had. Number 1, how could there be a diversity of Native American languages in such a short time if the Lehites were the only ones that populated Americas? 2, why does the Book of Mormon mention the horse when it had been introduced into the Spanish? These raised criticism back in 1921. Why does the Book of Mormon mention a steel bow when supposedly it wasn't known among the Jews? How could the Book of Mormon have mentioned scimitars, which again was no record at that time? And from where did the Nephites obtain silk if it had been unknown in the New World? Now, Roberts sent a response to Reiter with the best answers he could muster, but he wasn't really completely satisfied with the answers himself. Writing to the brethren, Roberts expressed his intent to study the difficulties in the Book of Mormon from a critical perspective. I quote, I am most thoroughly convinced of the necessity of all the brethren herein addressed becoming familiar with these Book of Mormon problems and finding the answer for them, as it is a matter that will concern the faith of the youth of the church now as also in the future, as well as such casual inquirers as may come to us from the outside world. He was concerned about our future day. What are people going to say? Roberts recorded his research for those who should be its students and know on what ground the Book of Mormon may be questioned, as well as how it supports its authenticity and truth. Roberts wrote to his friend Richard Lyman that a thorough digest of such difficulties would be advantageous to, quote, our future defenders of the faith, end quote. This digest resulted in the studies of the Book of Mormon, which wasn't published until 1985. Now, when Roberts previously wrote his New Witness, he had quoted from Ethan Smith, Josiah Priest, and others in support of Hebrew migrations to the New World. Now, with Couch's criticisms fresh on his mind, he began an in-depth study into the Book of Mormon from a critic's point of view. And then, playing devil's advocate, Roberts now looked at the writings of Ethan Smith, Priest, and James Adair as sources that critics might claim influenced the Book of Mormon. Roberts, who maintained his testimony of the Book of Mormon throughout his life, raised more questions than answers. But these questions gave future LDS scholars food for thought and, however, fuel for the critics. Farms. In 1979, Farms was born, at least in part because of a lack of good defense against the critics. John Welsh, the founder of Farms, wrote in review of an anthology hostile to the Book of Mormon, quote, I, for one, began my work on the Book of Mormon at a time when hardly anything positive had been written. from a scholarly point of view about its antiquity. I believe the balance needed to be tipped back by looking for, finding, and saying things in favor of the book, which implies that most things were not in favor of the book. Now, while currently only a part of Farmers' apologetic nature, much of Nibley's work, much of the reprints of Nibley's and articles in Farmers' Review books have been motivated by accusations of critics. Now, on the flip side, we've recently seen a mixed bag of attacks on the Book of Mormon. While most anti-Mormon rhetoric has been added very little by the way of new arguments or additional insights, other LDS critics, not generally lumped into the anti-Mormon category, have at times added fewer insights to the discussion. With the emergence of liberal writings such as those published in Dialogue and Sunstone, and books such as, if you're familiar with Brent Metcalf's New Approaches, we've been privileged to do discussions and investigations in the Book of Mormon issues. LDS anthropologist John Sorensen, who authored Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, once noted that from the time he began publishing on the Book of Mormon topics, he had urged his colleagues to criticize and thus improve his work. When some criticisms were raised, he found that they had a beneficial effect. He explained that these challenges have sent him back for a fuller look at his own work, after which he has come away confirmed in his view that his original theories were sound. Likewise, John Welch again noted that he was grateful to the authors of New Approaches for his making some valuable points. I quote, "I am happy to entertain new possibilities to help you to understand the full text in its ancient and modern context better. Even the good branches of the olive tree need to be trimmed periodically. By the same token, when I find errors of fact, method, or judgment in the works of others, I will not hesitate to point them out or call them into question. While the wheat and the tares are allowed to grow together in the field of the world, within the house of Israel, a different metaphor applies. Branches that produce bad fruit are cut off and cast into the fire." Which book came first? Now, LDS scholars have been split on which Book of Mormon book was translated after the loss of 116 pages. Some have suggested first Nephi, others have claimed priority of Words of Mormon, and others priority of Mosiah. LDS critic Brent Metcalf, who authored an article endorsing the priority of Mosiah for reasons which support his naturalistic assumptions of the Book of Mormon, noticed an apparent pattern in the usage of the words wherefore and therefore in the Book of Mormon, which affirmed his claims. This pattern suggests Joseph had a tendency to move from one word to an alternate version of the same word, and that same thing can be found in the Doctrine and Covenants. This suggests the pattern was due to a shift in Joseph Smith's usage of words. In reviewing this article, John Twytness, while disagreeing with Metcalf's conclusions for the significance of the priority of Mosiah, nevertheless noted that Metcalf provided, quote, valuable insights into the order of which the books comprising the Book of Mormon were dictated. Now, Royal Skousen, who we heard earlier, previously apparently favored the possibility of a first Nephi a priority. And he was also intrigued by Metcalf's observation and noticed so in his review of Metcalf's article, and he observed that on occasion some studies of the critics have been, quote, been beneficial to LDS scholarship, and he noted the interesting lexical pattern found by Metcalf. And then Metcalf, he responded to my queries on this subject. He replied, sometimes more academic approaches, even if antagonistic, can bring up issues that need to be researched. While Skousen explains that more research is still needed and that he has not reviewed all of the evidence available, he currently appears to lean towards the priority of Mosiah based on the information available. Nahum, with, if I pronounce that correctly, with the recent discovery of the ancient world site NHM, critics have rebutted the idea that this supports the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. S. Kent Brown, presentation in last year's Baylor conference, was to some degree initiated by these criticisms. Brown admits that these charges sent him back to the library for additional research. This research added to his understanding of the Nahum issue and simply strengthened his acceptance of NHM as a plausible candidate for the Book of Mormon, and that this information was probably not available to Joseph Smith. Plagiarism from the King James. From early on, some critics have found fault with the Book of Mormon because of its usage of King James language and supposedly King James passages. Two targets have been listed on there as main accusations. One more. Let's back up. I've got them all messed up. Okay, we have Isaiah. In the 1960s, a critical article was circulated which attempted to show that Joseph purposely interjected variants into the early Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon, but wearied of the task by the time he dictated the later Isaiah passages. This article caused John Twytness to research the issue, the results of which were printed in the Isaiah variants in the Book of Mormon, so you're familiar with that one. And his research, which of course came to different conclusions, has given us new insights into the differences between the two scriptures. The other one is the Sermon on the Mount. That's a frequent charge that Joseph Smith plagiarized the Sermon on the Mount. Some critics, as early as Reverend Lamb and more recently Stan Larson, have claimed that Joseph Smith plagiarized this. In 1990, 4 years after Larson printed his accusations, John Welch responded to Larson in his Sermon at the Temple and Sermon on the Mount. Then in 1998, Welch updated his book with even more information. Now there's no question that Welch's research contributed to Book of Mormon insights by dealing directly with the issues of the critics. To give one example, Welch, in a separate article responding to the criticisms of the same issue, noted how one critic had charged the Book of Mormon with error for quoting Jesus as saying that the righteous shall be filled with the Holy Ghost, in 3 Nephi 12:5. This critic claimed the Book of Mormon was wrong because the Greek word for filled referred to filling the stomach, not to being filled with the Holy Ghost. For more than a decade, John kept his criticism in the back of his mind and was unable to provide a good response. Now that's something important, I think, to remember, is that sometimes it takes a long time to find a response, but they're there. Then one day he found out in the Septuagint the use of the name Greek filled with the meaning of being filled with the Spirit, being satiated with the likeness of God. DNA. This is one of the newest criticisms against the Book of Mormon. As noted earlier, the one-time popular view among Latter-day Saints was that all Indians were Lamanites, that they were all descendants of the same group. Some critics, such as Lamb, pointed out that such a claim was untenable. P.H. Roberts suggested that there might have been other groups simultaneously inhabiting Americas with the Lehites, despite the Book of Mormon issue or silence on the issue. He didn't really accept it, but he said it's possible. Within the last few decades, other LDS scholars have come to conclude that not only were there others here when the Lehites arrived, but also the Lehites were a very small group, which made very little, if any, impact on the surrounding native cultures. If anything, the Nephites and original Lamanites were influenced more by the surroundings than the other way around. Of course, Brent Gardner has spoken quite a bit about that type of topic. Now, with the event of DNA studies, we find that such position must be correct. In fact, it demonstrates that the traditional LDS view is most definitely an error, and that the current LDS view, possibly again influenced to some degree by charts of critics, the study of which is most likely possibility. Now, some early DNA critics said that they used the evidence against a straw man, basically saying that they used it against the traditional view rather than the current view of limited grouping in Book of Mormon geography. Newer critics, however, go a step further and claim that DNA studies demonstrate that there is no evidence of an Israelite infusion, even for a small group in ancient America. When no LDS geneticists initially wrote rebuttals to the criticism, John Sorensen became one of the first. And he responded to the, quote, premature and dogmatic statements about the lack of Jewish genes among Amerindians. The ensuing debate soon after gathered the attention of other LDS DNA experts. Scott Wood, for those again that attended last year's conference, talked about this. The debate is still continuing and stimulating LDS scholars to further understand the relationship between DNA findings and the infusion of Lehites into ancient America. The ongoing research for this debate should be interesting. History. That's the other major area. One more forward. Passed up another one here. Boy, I've got it all messed up. Fawn Brody. In 1946, David O. McKay's niece, Fawn Brody, wrote a book entitled No Man Knows My History, which is still hailed by a lot of critics as the definitive work on Joseph Smith. And I think Lou Midgley would have some comments about that. She was one of the first critics to continue where B.H. Roberts had left off with the supposed Ethan Smith connection to the Book of Mormon. She attempted to demonstrate that Joseph sponged information from his environment when he authored the Book of Mormon. And while her book was mostly ignored by LDS historians who nimbly poked fun at her, and actually he delved more into his Book of Mormon research than that, Lou Midgley notes that it did have an impact on the Brethren. They had by and large ignored the Book of Mormon until she published the book. The Book of Mormon, as I mentioned earlier, was not really an object of study among the saints, and it kind of threw it into our faces, and we had to study more because of it. Okay, we have the Tanners, and they're among, of course, the most prolific anti-Mormons. And while they've criticized a lot of areas of Mormonism, but they really haven't had much influence on the LDS scholarship outside of maybe having to do with history. That seems to be the main area. In the 1960s, in fact, there are many areas in reprints. In 1960, when primary LDS documents were difficult to secure, the Tanners were busy reproducing, at times by less than ethical means, and definitely for polemical purposes, they reproduced many hard-to-get early LDS documents. In 1961, for instance, in their first venture into reprinting LDS texts, the Tanners reproduced a complete edition of the 1833 Book of Commandments. Following this printing, they reproduced several other LDS works, including Times and Seasons, an 1851 edition of the Pearl Great Price, 3 volumes of the Messenger and Advocate, 7 volumes of the Millennial Star, several pamphlets by Orson Pratt, excerpts from Clayton's Diary of Joseph Smith, and then many, many other works, and these were all hard to get. In fact, they were unavailable to the general public, and if you wanted them, you had to get them from the Tanners. And their productions, in turn, stimulated other publishers, including the church itself, to reprint some of these earlier texts. Let's go ahead and back out of that one, too. Lawrence Foster wrote an article about the Tanners, said, the larger impact of such publication efforts has been to help some Mormons become more aware of their rich heritage and to encourage scholarly attention to the fascinating early days of the Mormon movement. And while the Tanners' own works in Mormon history are lacking, their publications, nevertheless, help stimulate historical studies that they have highlighted issues which need to be resolved. Now, some LDS historians have expressed appreciation for the availability of this hard-to-get texts, even though they came by way of anti-Mormons. More than one LDS historian has supposedly said, with tongue planted firmly in cheek, the church should subsidize the Tanners because of all the historical research they do for it. Reed Derman, who was a former director of the LDS Institute of Religion at the U of U, gave a speech in 1972 wherein he acknowledged that along with the threat of harm that the Tanners pose to the church, they have done more to put together sources for research than anyone else outside of the church. They've become very important in understanding our church history. Derman went on to explain that he purchased the reproductions of the Tanners because he wanted the primary sources that was a part of his heritage, and the Tanners were the only ones producing that. Then he quotes Lehi's statement of opposition to all things, like Guy did, and then he continues. Back up. I think we passed one up there. I saw it earlier. There we go. I can't help but think that when they raise these issues, it does something to us to have to defend. When I see something that counters what I've been taught, or what I know, or what I understand, or what I feel, the way to counter research, unpleasant to me, is not by sticking my head in the sand like an ostrich, but by more research. I may have to revamp, and knowledge sometimes is a dangerous thing. And I don't know if the next one continues on this or not. They're so messed up. Here we go. But I will revamp, and I will understand better my heritage. What I'm trying to say is that they have become, in a sense, catalysts to sharpen our own historical understanding. We had to get out of the stick and do some study and do some homework that sometimes we haven't done. Now, apparently, Durham's speech, sparked some notes among the brethren. A few years following Durham's speech, apparently copies were being passed around on this. Apostle Ezra Taft Benson delivered a talk to the religious educators in Salt Lake City, wherein he said, "It has come to our attention that some of our teachers, particularly in our university programs, are purchasing writings from known apostates or from other liberal sources in an effort to become informed about certain points of view or to glean from their research. You must realize that when you purchase their writings or subscribe to the periodicals, you help sustain the cause. We would hope that their writings not be on your seminary or institute or personal bookshelves. We're entrusting you to represent the Lord in the first presidency to your students." That's a key thing, to your students, not the view of the detractors of the church. Now, he had a legitimate right, because obviously it'd be inappropriate to use church funds to support groups that were drawing people out of the church. And even, of course, if using private funds, anti-Mormon materials in the hands of young, impressionable seminary and institute students sitting in those kind of classrooms can be spiritually dangerous. I don't, however, believe that Benson's advice is aimed at scholars who mine critical material in hopes of gleaning possible insights or perspectives not previously noticed, or apologists who are attempting to defend the faith for those whose testimonies may be weakened by such material. Obviously, it's impossible to respond to accusations unless you know what those accusations are. And while the church does not often publish, currently doesn't often publish apologetic works officially, they have at times suggested or encouraged apologetic writings. I don't know if Gilbert Sharps is here today, but I know that, there you go, at least in your new missionary book, I know you're saying there that the church suggested that, or encouraged you to write a response to the God Makers. So there is, the church obviously aware of this. Now, while the Tanners have made numerous unsupported or erroneous charges against the church, they have occasionally been correct in some insights pertaining to supposedly early LDS documents. Gerald, for instance, denounced one early pamphlet attributed to Oliver Cowdery as a forgery. He was correct. And as Foster notes, this is, quote, only one example of research and analysis which would do credit to any professional historian. And the Tanners were also among the first to question the authenticity of the Hoffman-Salamander letter in the face of experts who claimed that it was authentic. Gerald claimed that it was sounded too much like the early anti-Mormon book, Mormonism Unveiled, by E.D. Howe. LDS historian Scott Fallring told me, quote, few people took notice of Gerald's concerns, and in the end, he was right. As Mark Hoffman later confessed, they had lifted ideas and phrases from Howe's book. And the Tanners, of course, have also seen fit to denounce some of the more outlandish anti-Mormon distortions, such as the horrific Godmakers 2, which was so much lower than the first one. Okay, let's see if we've got to follow through the next slide here. Seer stones and treasure digging. There we go. And this was talked about a little bit yesterday. When the Tanners accused Joseph Smith of glass-looking, digging for treasure by way of the seer stone, and was being charged for his activities in the 1826 trial, most LDS apologists disregarded the charges coming from the anti-Mormon contemporaries of Joseph's day. LDS church historians, wrote Marvin Hill, have responded over the years with accounts which minimize or deny any money-digging connections. New discoveries and supposed discoveries reopened the debate. The first was the discovery of the 1826, and we're not going to talk about that. Russ Anderson talked about it yesterday. Prior to this, as I think he noted, and Matt Roper made some comments about it, this presumably authentic document, most LDS apologists, including Whitstow, Kirkham, and Nibley, denied that there was such a court case or that it ever happened. Now, with the emergence of the Hoffman forgeries, especially against the Salamander letter, the Saints saw renewed interest in Joseph Smith and his early seer stone activities. LDS scholars began to seriously study the issue, and new conclusions were the result. And some of these conclusions weren't a lot different than what the anti-Mormons were saying, that was he involved in treasure digging. Marvin Hill pointed out that both sides have seemingly assumed until very recently that if Joseph Smith believed in and practiced magic to find buried treasure, and magic is probably good in quotations there, then his story of the inspired discovery of the plates of the Book of Mormon was suspect. Now, however, we know that that was part of the culture. And again, Russ Anderson addressed that yesterday, that there was a lot of people outside of Latter-day Saints that were involved in looking for treasures. D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism Magic Worldview was most likely influenced by Hoffman's forgeries, and thus they were based on some false premises. However, his chapter on seer stones and treasure digging, Richard Anderson wrote to me once that it has validity. Hoffman's forgeries also sparked BYU studies to devote an entire issue to Joseph's treasure digging days. The combination of Hoffman's forgeries and old anti-Mormon arguments forced Latter-day Saint scholars to research, and that research ended up adding additional light to early LDS cultures and Joseph Smith's early seer stone days. Smith family. At times, critics have opened other windows in the early life of Smith and his family. Brother Twitness, for instance, noted that he found some interesting yet unfamiliar details about the religious turmoil in Joseph Smith's time when he was reviewing one critic's work. And when Quinn wrote about the timing of Joseph's marriage to Emma and how Joseph brought Emma with him to get the plates because Alvin, who originally the angel said bring Alvin, well, Alvin was dead. And so Joseph brought Emma. Richard Lloyd Anderson, when I queried him on this, he said that Quinn is onto a legitimate body of material here and puts it all out fairly well, however, with his own interpretations. Richard L. Bushman notes that through years of research, LDS critics Marquardt and Walters have dug up tidbits of info to help us understand life among the Smiths. Their studies, Bushman observed, has added new material to the record of Joseph Smith. He points out, however, that they have a lot of errors in their conclusions. First Vision. In 1967, Mormon critic Wesley P. Walters wrote a tract entitled New Light on Mormon Origins, which challenged the traditional account of Joseph Smith's events leading to the First Vision. He questioned if there was really a revival in the 1820s. He said if there was no revival, then there's no First Vision. The tract stimulated a host of activity, including the creation of a BYU group that went back to Palmyra to research the First Vision. In 1969, an entire issue of BYU study was devoted to the research. This issue, notes Daniel Bachman, almost single-handedly, along with the discovery of Pyra, rejuvenated BYU studies. Milton Bachman's books on the First Vision restoration of for example, were outgrowths of that group's efforts. The controversy also prompted research and publications by LDS historian Larry Porter. Such research might not have arisen had it not been for Walter's article. Bachman believes that, quote, the influence of Walters and the BYU group still influence historical research today. New Midgley observed, to me, we are almost always a step behind the critics. The initial serious look at the Palmyra materials and the so-called issue of whether there was a revival that got Joseph Smith started, and a host of similar issues were originally motivated by our desire to have a reasonable response to our critics. 2 years after Walter published his article, Dialogue republished it, an updated version, as well a response by Richard Bushman. While Bushman had some disagreements with Walter's conclusions, he also recognized that Walters had set us back because Mr. Walters, quote, took an entirely new track and followed it with admirable care. And I continue his quote, were the revivals in 1819 to 20 in the vicinity of Palmyra, as Joseph said? Everyone up until now had assumed that of course they were. Walters said no, and the sources of his answers were impressive. They stood apart from the biased materials on which most anti-Mormon work is based. They were contemporaneous with the event, and they were right to the point. Our consternation was a genuine compliment to the quality of Walters' work. While Mr. Walters has put us on the spot for a moment, in the long run, Mormon scholarship will benefit from his attack. Not only was there an immediate effort to answer the question of an 1819 revival, but Mormon historians asked themselves how many other questions about our early history remained unasked as well as unanswered. Without wholly intending it, Mr. Walters may have done as much to advance the cause of Mormon history within the church as anyone in recent years. Now, even more recently, Bushman has written on the ongoing research of Palmyra revivals, quote, can we reconcile all the conflicting evidence and get back to the actual chronology of the events from 1816 to 1824? At this point, we must acknowledge the possibility of an error somewhere in Joseph's chronology, simply because of the internal contradiction. On the other hand, we are well advised to take care of throwing out the report of a person who was on the scene merely because circumstantial evidence raises doubts. Other historical issues that have surfaced because of charges of the critics, and we've learned more. Richard Anderson's important work on the Book of Mormon Witnesses, excellent book, and again, part of it devoted to answering directly critics. Joseph Smith's possible ownership of the Jupiter talisman, and also even Michael Quinn's article on the involvement of LDS women in the blessing of the sick. And I throw him in. At the time, he was not out of the church, but he was a critic to many degrees, and anyhow, that's brought more studies around. Okay, let's move on to some of the smaller categories here. How much time we've got left? Book of Abraham studies. In 1879, Reynolds and Sajodol, I don't know how he pronounces that, Sajodol, whatever, had observed that while the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price had been, quote, vigorously attacked by opponents, the saints had, quote, written little in its defense. Little seemed to change for a number of years. And in 1912, the critics again made some virtually uncontested charges against the Book of Mormon. Nibley complained that the saints, quote, frankly admitted their ignorance and pleaded that they had been caught by surprise, unquote. But again, nothing changed. The saints had the opportunity to fortify their Book of Mormon scholarship, but they failed to do so. So in 1967, when things heated up, when the Metropolitan Museum of Art presented the Joseph Smith Papyrus to the church, Hugh Nibley lamented the saints' lack of response in 1912 and their disregard for the stimulus such criticisms might have provided for deeper scholarship. He said, faced by a solid phalanx of PhDs, which the Egyptologists criticized the Book of Abraham, the Mormons were properly overawed. They had no David to go against these Goliaths. And for that, they had only themselves to blame. The Mormons would have done well in undertaking some study of Egyptian on their own. Now, Nibley notes that Joseph and Brigham had pleaded with the saints for years to use your brains and to prepare yourselves just for such eventualities. But when critics attacked in 1912, the saints had not turned the stumbling blocks into stepping stones. They had passed on the opportunity. The Mormons, Nibley criticized, appeared to, quote, have gone all out for the gimmicks and mechanics of education, but have never evinced any real inclination to tackle the tough, basic questions of evidence raised by the Pearl of Great Price. And then Nibley shares some advice that I think is still insightful today. One should not enter the arena unless one is willing to meet more formidable opposition than the gullible student and a tractable layman. It behooves us to understand the opposition, know where they're coming from, know why they have the arguments. Now, when the rediscovered Joseph Smith Papyrus was the dialogue, printed some articles about it with some from Tanner and Hugh Nibley and others researching the Book of Mormon, and some of those issues they brought up are still being researched today. Through the past few decades, the Book of Abraham, I might say Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham has seen increased attention from LDS scholars and research, and of course critics. Nibley produced several works on the subject and hopes soon to finish his decades-long One Eternal Round. And the critics have helped to sharpen pencils along the way. In 1979, for instance, at a Sunstone Symposium, LDS critic Ed Ashman pointed out some supposed errors in Nibley's assessments of the Joseph Papyrus. Nibley responded graciously, thanking Ashman for the constructive criticisms. Book of Mormon is penned by Abraham. Evidence suggests that possibly some early Latter-day Saints believed that the Egyptian papyri were actually penned by those authors who were linked to the documents. So back up again, another one's missing. In an 1841 example, William Appleby observed that, quote, there is a perceptible difference between the writings of Joseph of old and Abraham. Joseph, wrote Appleby, appears to have been the best scribe, which suggests that he thought they were actually written, scribed by those two people. That's one of the possible interpretations. Critics, of course, have pointed out that the papyri is far too recent to be written actually by Abraham. And if it's not, then what's the connection? John Gee explains that there is a major difference between the date of a text, the information contained on the papyri, and the date of the manuscript, the papyri itself. For example, Paul's letter to the Galatians was written in the 1st century, but most of the manuscripts date to much later. The current state of Book of Abraham scholarship is exciting. The past few years, Farms has had more than one conference devoted to the topic. We have the senior republication of Nibley's Abraham in Egypt, John Gee's A Guide to the Joseph Papyri, the recently published Traditions about the Early Life of Abraham, and just the new hot off the press, the Horror Book of Breathings, a translation and commentary by Michael Rose, just came out. With the possibility of critical publications on the Book of Abraham in the works by Metcalf, Ashman, and company. That's something that he says might be along the lines of new approaches to the Book of Abraham. I'm sure that our understanding will only continue to get better. Oh, back up on Bible studies. Okay, there we go. Joseph Smith translation. While not responding specifically to critics, to a specific critic, Kevin Barney's dialogue articles have added to the insights. Some of you that might have read those about the possible holes in the LDS approach of Joseph Smith translation that is an actual textual reconstruction. We won't get too much detail about it. Go ahead, next one there. I don't know how these got all out of order. Let's go ahead and back up. Let me just finish along here what I've got. New Testament Christianity. Direct response to popular charges that Mormons aren't Christians, we've been blessed with a clear understanding of how the New Testament defines Christians, as well as a more accurate picture of Christianity in the first centuries. Daniel Peterson and Stephen Ricks in the Defenders for a Word, and Stephen Robinson's Are Mormons Christians, and then also Stephen Robinson and Craig Blomberg's How Wide the Divide, are direct results of the anti-Mormon accusations that Latter-day Saints aren't Christians. Deification and theosis, Roger Cook, of course, spoke today on that, and there's been a lot of work that has come about because of accusations that LDS teaching that we can become like Heavenly Father is contra-Christian. Baptism for the dead. Hugh Nibley's 1948 and 1949 Improvement Error articles on the ancient Christian practice of baptism of the dead seems to be initiated, at least in part, because of the critics. I think that's what this slide says. The work for the dead is an all-important phase of Mormonism about which the world knows virtually nothing. Not even the most zealous anti-Mormon has even begun to offer an explanation for its discovery. The critics will have to go far to explain this one. And of course, there's been more recent articles by Schwedness, Peterson, Ricks, and so forth on this. Martin Luther, here's an interesting one. For many years, Latter-day Saints, in support of belief in apostasy, have repeated this quote from Martin Luther. Hit the return button instead of the pages down. Maybe we're skipping over something there. Here we go. I have sought nothing, this is supposedly Martin Luther, I have sought nothing beyond reforming the church in conformity with the Holy Scriptures. The spiritual powers have been corrupted not only by sin, but absolutely destroyed, so that there is now nothing in them but a depraved reason and a will that is the enemy and opponent of God. I simply say that Christianity has ceased to exist among those who should have preserved it. Now, this quote was apparently first used in an LDS tract on the apostasy. In July 2000, however, LDS critic Bill Barton Those of you that are on Zion's Lighthouse will be familiar with him. He demonstrated this quote as an amalgamation of 3 unrelated statements by Martin Luther and doesn't accurately reflect what Luther was expressing. Barton was correct. The person responsible for the LDS pamphlet was sloppy, and the quote should have been constructed. Kevin Barney wrote an article on the FAIR web page that deals with this issue and requests the cessation of further reference as an accurate quote. Occasionally the critics are right. In concluding here, nearly all LDS apologists who might converse on this topic of my paper tell me the same thing. The accusations of critics have prompted them to greater research, which resulted in a clear understanding of the issues. Scott Follering has estimated, in response to my queries, that about 25 to 30% of his research has been motivated by the inaccurate or warped interpretation of our religious opponents. And he says it's a sad fact that sometimes the critics do get it right, but we ignore their findings because of who they are. Stephen Ricks replied, I can say that my insights have been sharpened by responding to implicitly or explicitly anti-Mormon statements. And to quote Kevin Barney again here, probably love me putting this up, I think we need a certain level of outside criticism. We're not very tolerant of in-house criticism, but we need some sort of criticism to cause us to rethink and reevaluate what we do, our literature, our doctrine, and so forth. Without such critiques, we could get mired in iconoclastic provincial thought and practices. The best disinfectant is sunshine, as they say. If we were just Mormons in Utah, if the railroad never came, and we were left totally to our own devices, you and I would have multiple wives. We would believe Adams are God and blacks would not hold the priesthood. It is not for the critics, if not for the critics, FAIR wouldn't exist. And the research which had resulted in FAIR organization, as well as other apologetic websites, discussion boards, and so forth, wouldn't be around. Now, just as I can't say we look forward to stumbling blocks any more than I look forward to other character-building trials in my personal life, nobody wants to be a Job, I can say that by turning stumbling blocks into stepping stones, we have the opportunity to grow spiritually and intellectually. So I hope I got this last one. Here we go. It's from David Lynn. I've seen this down at the new conference center's painting. It's called Ascent. I think this painting encapsulates how stumbling blocks can stub toes, twist ankles, trip up weak or careless travelers, and hinder or halt forward progression. When turned into stepping stones, however, slippery paths are easier to climb. With stepping stones, we can help each other ascend up the path of knowledge and understanding of Mormonology. To quote Orson Pratt, convince us of our errors of doctrine, if we have any, by reason, by logical argument, or by the Word of God, and we will be ever grateful for the information, and you will ever have the pleasing reflection that you have been instruments in the hands of God of redeeming your fellow beings from the darkness which you may see enveloping their minds. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, so if anybody would like to ask Mike any questions, please see the mic up there. See the mic? See Mike here. Go to the mic there and talk to the mic here.
Kevin Winters. There's 2 questions in 3 parts. First, at the beginning of this year, the New Mormon Challenge came out. As those who are familiar with it, it's most recent sort of scholarly approach to Mormon criticism. First, if you have read it, what is your view on the New Mormon Challenge? And secondly, what do you think that will do both to anti-Mormonism and Mormon apologetics?
I honestly haven't read the book yet. I've been involved in other readings, and so I can't give an honest response, just what I've seen reviews from other apologists, so can't answer that one. That was an easy, simple question. Wow.
Can't really say I had a huge question for you, but the comments that you offered and stuff does bring this back to mind. I was reading an address that was actually given at a farm's banquet by Dallin H. Oaks. I'm sure that you probably read it. And he quoted Austin Farrer. He said that though argument does not create conviction, lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. Your comments to me exemplified exactly why I am in the apologetics. Not so that I can prove someone else wrong, so I can maintain a plausible area of growth in which I and others can exist, and that anti-Mormons do assist us in struggling to learn more. For instance, the talk that we just had, or the address that was just offered on theosis, I had a huge conversation with two anti-Mormons on that and knew nothing, almost nothing about the King Follett discourse. I'd read it, but hadn't really studied it until I got into this. And got a six parallel column, the sixth parallel column on that thing, and got this book and that book, and had to study all this stuff, and it really did force me to grow. And so I appreciate your comments. Just think that was an amazing address. Just want to let you know.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That quote that from Austin Farrar, that was actually in my twice as long version that I had to whittle down some things out of, but I love that quote. It was really true. Renee Olson made, I think, a good analogy that I was going to mention in yesterday's talk to those of you here, where she mentioned how Joseph was thrown, of course, into the pit there and sold in Egypt. I mean, that all looked like bad things, and of course, good came out of it. And the trials in our personal life, as well as in apologetics, I mean, these things, we can turn these stumbling blocks into stepping stones and help us.
Thank you very much. All right, it's time for our break. We would like to announce that we are going to close the auction at the end of the break. So during the last talk, we will be calculating who won what and how much you owe.